February 14th, 1797. The Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Portugal. Commodore Horatio Nelson stood on the quarterdeck of HMS Captain and watched a Spanish fleet of 27 warships begin to escape. His admiral's plan was working, but too slowly. In minutes, the Spanish would close the gap between their two groups, reform their line, and sail away to Cadiz. The invasion of Britain would become possible again. Nelson had two options: follow his orders, stay in formation, and watch the moment slip away. Or do something that no Commodore in the Royal Navy had ever dared: take his single ship out of the line without orders and charge directly into the largest warships in the world. If he was wrong, he would be court-martialed. His ship would be destroyed. He would die a disgraced officer. If he was right, he would save Britain. Nelson took his ship out of the line. What happened in the next 2 hours was so extraordinary that the Royal Navy named a tactical manoeuvre after it. This is the Battle of Cape St. Vincent. The day one man's decision changed the course of the war. Welcome to Britain's history. Today we're covering the battle that made Nelson, the moment when a Commodore from Norfolk disobeyed his admiral's orders, fought 4 ships simultaneously, and personally led a boarding party across 2 enemy decks. Because Cape St. Vincent isn't just a story about tactics, it's about a man who understood something most commanders never learn: that the difference between victory and defeat is sometimes a single officer willing to act when everyone else is waiting. But before we get to Nelson's charge, before we watch HMS Captain crash into the Spanish line, we need to understand just how desperate Britain's situation was in February 1797. Because without knowing how close Britain came to losing everything, you can't appreciate what that one decision meant. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into naval history, make sure you're subscribed. We've got dozens more battles lined up, each one as dramatic as this. Don't miss them. Let's go back to 1796, when Britain's strategic position collapsed almost overnight. For years, Spain had been Britain's ally, or at least not her enemy. But in August 1796, Spain signed the Treaty of San Ildefonso, with revolutionary France switching sides entirely. Overnight, Britain went from having one great naval enemy to 2, and combined the French and Spanish fleets could put more than 60 ships of the line to sea. Britain simply could not defend the English Channel and the Mediterranean simultaneously. The Admiralty made the painful decision: abandon the Mediterranean entirely. British garrisons in Corsica and Elba were evacuated. The fleet withdrew. For the first time in decades, Britain had no presence in the inland sea that connected her to her Eastern Empire. Think about what that meant for ordinary British people in the winter of 1796 to 97. The newspapers were full of French victories on the continent. Austria had been knocked out of the war. Britain had no allies left on European soil. And in December 1796, a French fleet actually managed to land soldiers in Ireland, at Bantry Bay, before storms drove them back. The invasion that Britons had feared for years had almost happened. The sense of national crisis was unlike anything since the Spanish Armada 2 centuries earlier. Spain's fleet had a specific mission: sail from Cartagena to Cadiz, pick up troops and supplies, then head north to join the French fleet at Brest. Once united, that combined armada would escort an invasion force across the Channel. Britain's survival was not a metaphor, it was a military calculation being worked out in Cadiz harbour. Against this threat, the Admiralty sent Admiral Sir John Jervis with 15 ships of the line to intercept the Spanish fleet. 15 against 27. By every calculation of the age, those were impossible odds. One of Jervis's captains reportedly told him the Spanish had 27 ships. Jervis replied, "Enough, sir, no more of that. The die is cast, and if there are 50 ships, I will go through them." This was the man Nelson served under. Jervis, nicknamed Old Jarvie by his sailors, not always affectionately, was one of the most demanding officers in the Royal Navy. He drove his men hard, his discipline was ferocious. But his ships were the best trained in the fleet, and every man aboard them knew exactly what was expected in battle. When the moment came, Jervis's fleet would perform like a machine. The Spanish fleet, commanding the largest warship in the world, had problems that went far deeper than numbers. Admiral Don José de Cordoba commanded a fleet that looked magnificent on paper. His flagship alone, the Santissima Trinidad, carried between 130 and 136 guns and was a vessel so enormous that British sailors could barely believe what they were seeing when she came into range. Spain's fleet had 27 ships of the line to Britain's 15. On the face of it, there was no contest, but Spain had been at peace for years. Her sailors hadn't been at sea. Her crews were understaffed by at least 4,000 experienced men, replaced instead with soldiers and conscripted peasants who had never worked a ship in their lives. The Spanish treasury was essentially bankrupt. The fleet hadn't received proper resupply in months. A ship of the line is only as good as the men who sail her, and in February 1797, most of the men sailing Spain's fleet had no idea what they were doing. By contrast, Jarvis's 15 ships had been at sea almost continuously, running blockades, chasing French squadrons, keeping their crews sharp. British gunnery in this period was simply in a different class. A trained British crew could fire 3 broadsides, in the time a Spanish crew managed one. In a fleet action, that differential was decisive. On the morning of February 14th, St. Valentine's Day, the two fleets found each other off Cape St. Vincent, the southwestern tip of Portugal. The Spanish fleet was in disarray. Days of storms and poor navigation had split Cordoba's force into 2 uneven groups, with a gap of several miles between them. 18 ships in the larger group to the north, 9 ships in the smaller group to the south, and between those 2 groups, an opportunity. Jarvis saw it immediately. He drove his fleet in a single column directly through the gap, cutting the Spanish fleet in 2. The smaller southern group was isolated, separated from the main fleet, unable to assist. Jarvis's ships passed through and began turning north to engage the larger group before they could reunite with their separated comrades. It was brilliant seamanship, but it wasn't enough. The Spanish admiral saw what was happening. He began turning his larger group, 18 ships, southward and westward, trying to sweep around behind the British column, pick up his isolated ships, and escape to Cadiz. If he succeeded, the entire Spanish fleet would slip away intact. The threat would simply be deferred, not destroyed. Jarvis issued the order. Ships were to tack in succession, turning one by one at the same point in the water, swinging the British column around to pursue the Spanish. It was the correct order. It was also going to be too slow. Nelson, near the rear of the British line in HMS Captain, watched the geometry of the battle and understood exactly what was about to happen. By the time the British column had turned ship by ship, the Spanish would have passed. The moment would be gone. He had seconds to decide. He wore his ship, turning her rapidly to bring her bow around, and drove HMS Captain out of the British line, directly toward the Spanish van, without orders, without permission, against every regulation in the Royal Navy's book. Nelson put his ship between 18 Spanish vessels and their escape route. What followed was not a battle in any conventional sense. It was one ship trying to delay a fleet by sheer aggression and refusing to be sunk. HMS Captain took fire from multiple directions simultaneously. The Santissima Trinidad alone outgunned her by more than 2 to 1. The San Josef, the San Nicolas, the Salvador del Mundo, ships that dwarfed the Captain in size and firepower, all brought their guns to bear. Nelson's ship was being torn apart. Her steering failed. Her sails were shot to pieces. Officers and men fell around him on the deck. But Nelson achieved what he needed to achieve. He bought time. While HMS Captain fought and bled and refused to die, the rest of Jarvis's fleet completed its turn. British ships closed with the Spanish one by one, and the battle became the general engagement Jarvis had wanted. The Spanish fleet, which had been on the verge of escaping in good order, was now fighting for its survival. And then Nelson did something that would have seemed impossible, even 5 minutes earlier. HMS Captain, her steering gone, drifted alongside the 80-gun Spanish ship, San Nicolas. The ships became entangled, their rigging locked together, their hulls grinding against each other. For a conventional officer, this was disaster. For Nelson, it was opportunity. He ordered a boarding party. His first lieutenant, Edward Berry, went over the side first, climbing onto the San Nicolas's stern gallery. Nelson followed, the men behind him, Sailors and soldiers of the 69th Regiment of Foot, who happened to be aboard, poured across behind them. There was pistol fire, sword work, men fighting hand-to-hand in the confined space of the Spanish upper decks. Within minutes, the San Nicolas was taken. But as Nelson stood on the captured deck, he found himself under fire from above. The massive San Josef, 112 guns, one of the most powerful ships afloat, had crashed into the San Nicolas during the fighting and become entangled with her. Her crew was firing down into the captured ship, trying to retake her or at least cover their comrades. Nelson looked up at the towering Spanish first rate. He looked at the men around him, exhausted, some wounded, standing on a ship they had just seized by the sword. He is reported to have said, "Westminster Abbey or victory." He led his boarding party up the side of the San Josef. The Spanish captain of the San Josef came to meet him on the quarterdeck. He surrendered his sword. One by one his officers followed, handing their swords to Nelson on the deck of a ship they had still been firing their guns from minutes before. The San Josef's flag came down. Nelson had captured 2 ships of the line, back to back, from a ship that was barely afloat, using the deck of one captured enemy vessel as a bridge to board another. The manoeuvre passed into naval legend immediately. His men called it Nelson's Patent Bridge for boarding first rates, and the name stuck. The battle continued around him. The Santissima Trinidad, the great leviathan of the Spanish fleet, had been fighting multiple British ships and struck her colours, hauled down her flag in surrender, before Spanish reinforcements arrived and allowed her to be pulled clear. It was one of the bitter disappointments of the day. The most powerful warship in the world came within minutes of capture and escaped, but 4 other Spanish ships of the line were taken: San Josef, San Nicolas, Salvador del Mundo, and San Isidro. The Spanish fleet limped into Cadiz. Their plan to join the French fleet at Brest was finished. The invasion threat that had terrified Britain for a year was, for now, broken. Here is a question worth sitting with. Nelson disobeyed a direct order. There is no ambiguity about that. He took his ship out of line without authorization, which in the Royal Navy of 1797 was a court-martial offence. If his manoeuvre had failed, if HMS Captain had simply been destroyed and the Spanish had escaped, Nelson would have faced disgrace. Jarvis might have hanged him. Was he right to disobey? Or is it only a brilliant decision because it worked? What's your view? Drop it in the comments. The aftermath was immediate and extraordinary. Jarvis received an earldom. He became Earl St. Vincent, taking his title from the battle. Nelson was knighted, promoted to Rear Admiral, and celebrated throughout Britain in a way that no naval officer had been since Rodney. He was 38 years old. 8 years later, he would die at Trafalgar, the most famous sailor in the history of the world. But Cape St. Vincent was where it began, where Nelson stopped being a competent Commodore and became a legend. Aboard the captured San Josef, as Spanish officers filed past to surrender their swords, a simple British sailor stepped forward and held out his hat. Each sword was placed in it as it was handed over, and the sailor held them all while Nelson received the surrenders. It is one of the great images of the age. The ceremony of defeat, conducted with a Tar's hat standing in for a velvet cushion. Britain loved that story. It still does. What made Cape St. Vincent decisive was not just the ships captured, it was what the battle prevented. Spain's fleet never reached Brest. The combined French-Spanish armada that was supposed to escort an invasion force across the Channel never materialised. The window for a French invasion of Britain, which was real and credible in early 1797, closed. Not permanently, but for long enough for the war to shift, long enough for Nelson to fight again at the Nile, at Copenhagen, and finally at Trafalgar. The strategic picture in early 1797 was genuinely frightening for Britain. Mutinies were breaking out in the fleet at Spithead and the Nore. Sailors driven to collective action by poor pay, rotten food, and brutal discipline. Ireland was restive and would rise in rebellion the following year. The French economy, for all its revolutionary disruption, was being reinvigorated by Italian plunder while Britain's currency came under pressure. A few disasters at sea at this moment could have been catastrophic. Jarvis's victory off Cape St. Vincent gave Britain something she desperately needed: proof that she could still fight, that the Royal Navy was still the finest instrument of war afloat, that 15 ships could take on 27 and win. The country celebrated in a way that only Britain can celebrate a naval victory, with a roar of pride that carried across the Channel and into the courts of Europe. And somewhere in that celebration was something deeper than relief. The British public, reading the newspaper accounts of Nelson boarding one Spanish ship and immediately boarding another from its deck, felt something that is hard to articulate but unmistakable: pride in a particular kind of courage. Not the courage of armies charging across a field, the courage of one man deciding, in a fraction of a second, that the rules could wait. The Royal Navy would take that lesson forward. At the Nile in 1798, Nelson would attack at night, inside a harbour, in a move that no French admiral thought possible. At Trafalgar in 1805, he would split his fleet into 2 columns and drive them directly at the enemy line, the boldest tactical conception in the history of sail. Both battles built on what Cape St. Vincent had proved: that aggressive initiative, taken at the right moment by the right man, is worth more than any number of guns. The Santa Sima Trinidad, the ship that got away, did not escape forever. She was present at Trafalgar 8 years later, fighting on the same side, and was so badly damaged that she sank after the battle. The San Joseph, the ship Nelson captured from the deck of the San Nicolas, went into Royal Navy service as HMS San Joseph and remained a British warship for 30 years. Nelson himself served aboard her briefly as his flagship. He was sailing the ship he had taken with his own sword. Martin Alvarez, the Spanish marine who fought to the last to protect San Nicolas's flag, who killed a British sergeant defending what he had sworn to defend, and was left for dead, and was found still breathing, and was released on Nelson's personal order because Nelson respected what he had seen, kept his sword until he died. That sword is in the National Maritime Museum in London today. History remembers Nelson, but it also remembers, in its quieter corners, the men on both sides who did their duty completely, and the enemies who earned each other's respect. Cape St. Vincent was a victory, but it was also a demonstration of what the Royal Navy was, of what it could do, of what one officer's courage in a single decisive moment could mean for a nation's fate. Nelson knew he had done something extraordinary. He wrote home that night, to his wife, to his father, to friends, describing the action with a clarity that suggests he understood its significance even then. He had broken the rules, and the rules had bent around him, because what he had done was so undeniably right that no court-martial ever came. Jervis never formally reprimanded him. He praised him. 8 years later, dying on the deck of HMS Victory with a French musket ball in his chest, Nelson's last words were reportedly, "Thank God I have done my duty." At Cape St. Vincent, for the first time, the world learned what that duty looked like. This channel exists because these stories deserve to be told. The moments when one person's decision changed everything. The battles that look impossible until they are won. The officers who understood that the right rule to follow sometimes is the one you write yourself in the heat of the moment. Thank you for watching Britain's history, the stories that mattered, told the way they deserved.